Hello everyone, this is Lala, and today I'm going to make, or technically remake my Veronaville timeline since I did it a few years ago, then I deleted it, which I should have done, and now I'm going to do it now. Luckily, I still have the same slides that I did in my prior, now deleted video, so I'm going to just use that as the template, maybe add some additional commentary and all that jazz. Let's get right to it. So with this, I'm going to gather all the information that I did on the prior three videos where I covered each of the three main families based on actual facts and some slight headcanon to contribute to this very large timeline that, as you see, will cover a century period and go through all 5 generations, from the formation of Veronaville to the current timeline in the base game where it's currently at. Here I have the first timeline date being the 1870s and the 1880s. So this is 120 years before the events of the current timeline of Veronaville. And this is where the members of the 8 founding families of Veronaville, or who would become that, were born in places that I had canon as the Mediterranean, Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. I went into details about this, especially in the Capps and Montys lines. Some of them, actually, definitely a lot of the Capps and Montys family members are definitely Italian coded, so a lot of them are there. And I'm assuming some of the others, like Cleopatra Capps and many of the other families that would eventually marry into the Montys family, have ancestry from North Africa and the Middle East. So they are born in these areas. They are not born in what is eventually Veronaville. So they are not citizens of Veronaville based on birthright. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so I'm also going to show something else that I saw on ChatGPT when I just asked certain questions, and it kind of lines up with my timeline that I made up a few years ago. So I asked them to create a Veronaville timeline based on all 5 generations of the Capps and Montys family, and I'm going to incorporate the symmetry into it afterwards. And here's what it says. Veronaville timeline approximates based on generations. Let's assume that each generation spans 25 years, following the typical sim logic. Based on this, here's a reconstructive timeline of major events, from the founding ancestors to the current teens like Romeo and Juliette. Generation 1, circa 100 to 125 years before the game starts. So the game starts in 2004. So the timeline of this would be 1904 to 1889, I believe so. That's the time frame. So, Patrizio, Montys' grandparent, and Consort Capps' grandparent are born. Same as Isabella, Monty, and Contessa Capps' grandparents, they're all born. These founders may have migrated from different lands. The Montys from Italy, fictional town Monte d'Oro, and the Capps from local aristocracy. So that technically would be Contessa's lineup, not Consort's, but as you see with the Queen Thief and stuff like that, it could be the thieves as well. The Capps and Montys feud likely begins with this generation, perhaps over land, status, or a forbidden love. So here is what ChatGPT gave me when I asked them to go into further detail regarding the first generation, or the founding 8 families. So it has their estimated birth rate at around 1880 to 1900, which makes sense. The Capps line, so this is Cleopatra and Antony Capps. So they're likely descended from nobility from the Mediterranean or North Africa, obviously based off of Antony and Cleopatra. Calpurnia and Julius Caesar are Roman descent, where Julius may be a cousin to Antony. Interesting. When it comes to what would become the Thebe branch, we have Hecuba and Priam Albion being from Greek nobility, makes sense. Queen and Aethean Thebe, Queen's literally her name, are likely royalty from an eastern or island kingdom. Thebe equals Thebes, so I guess like the island in Greece. It says they are possibly related to the Summer Dream line. That's interesting. I don't know where they got that from. Now on to the Monty line. Bassanio and Portia Monty are Venetian nobility from the Merchant of Venice, or at least with their names. Angelo and Mariana Capitano, their origins are either Southern Italian or Spanish. From my research a few years ago and even recently, I kind of figured that their names might be Spanish. Their names are also from the measure for measure. Proteus and Julia Pantalone, they gave me a decent amount where they are most likely from Verona, makes sense, Veronaville, or northern Italy, and their family was steeped in performance, politics, and cunning. Proteus' name's after the unfaithful friend from Two Gentlemen of Verona, and Julia is the long-suffering, intelligent love interest from that same plane. The surname Pantalone comes from Commedia dell'arte, where Pantalone is an old Venetian merchant, a nod to wealth, manipulation, and theater. And the last people from this group is Lucio and Overdan Zani, where Lucio is a libertine noble and Overdan is a body and keeper. Zani equals Commedia dell'arte, stock character. At the turn of the 20th century, either the Victorian or Edwardian era, I think it's Victorian, but I'm kind of more leaning towards the Edwardian era at this point. I think it's closer to the Edwardian era, actually. But anyways, at the turn of the century, what would eventually become Veronaville is founded. And as you see, a lot of the eight founding families would become huge parts in this, where they essentially are the founding families of Veronaville. When it comes to the marriages, some of them could have married before entering Veronaville, some of them could have married after moving here, but they all, at some point, moved to Veronaville, and they spend a majority of their adulthood building the foundational elements of Veronaville and really building the neighborhood from the ground up, having this prestige due to being a part of the founding families. And that prestige would carry on through the next 4 generations up until the current iteration of the Monty and Cap families. Obviously, only 2 of these couples would have the Cap and Monty name. So, obviously, through the intermarrying through the generations, it would eventually just become 2 families. But at this stage, there are 8 different families, with only 2 of them being Cap and Monty by name at this point. I asked ChatGPT what most likely would have been each family branch of this generation's role in Veronaville, information on their marriage, and potential relationships and interactions with people within this generation. And here's what I got. Cleopatra and Antony Cap, role in Veronaville. Royal-style founders. Cleopatra brought wealth and Antony brought military strategy. Possibly the first to establish governance and aristocracy in Veronaville. Their marriage, a union born of alliance and desire, but possibly scandalous, uniting different cultures or rival kingdoms. Calpurnia and Julius Caesar. I don't know why it has the cap there. Roles in Veronaville, legal and bureaucratic architects. Julius helped codify the town's early laws and property rights. Marriage, formal and powerful, perhaps more political than romantic. Calpurnia was loyal but tragic, mirroring her Shakespearean counterpart. Relationships, Julius may have clashed with Antony over vision for Veronaville. Now we're moving on to the Cap branch families, Albion and Thebes, so essentially Consort Cap's branch. Hecuba and Priam Albion, role in Veronaville. Artistic and tragic lineage. Possibly patrons of the town's first theater and library, building its cultural core. Marriage. Deep but burdened. Hecuba may have had many children, only a few survived. Makes sense because she only has one. Not really, no. Or maybe this is their way of saying a bunch of miscarriages. Queen and Etienne Thebe, roles in Veronaville. Ambassadors and exotic newcomers who brought trade and luxury goods. Marriage, a rare matrilineal power dynamic. Queen was the dominant partner. Makes sense, the Thebes are matrilineal and her name's literally Queen. The Monty lines of Patrizio's branch. Bassanio and Portia Monty, role in Veronaville. Legal minds and business leaders. Portia brought wisdom and diplomacy, helping forge the Cap-Monty alliance before its collapse. Marriage, based on love but tested by greed and external pressures. Relationships with the Capps, once allies, later betrayed by Julius or Antony. So that's interesting there. Angelo and Mariana Capitano. Role in Veronaville. Religious and moral reformers. Built the town's first chapel and court. Marriage. Devout and stable but sometimes overbearing. Mariana had a quiet strength. So, we're going to move on to the Pantalone line, so that's Isabella's branch. Initially, they didn't have Proteus and Juliette Pantalone, they did the other... Everyone else but them, so when I told ChatGPT to do the Pantalone branch, i.e. Proteus and Julia, they gave me a lot more detail than they did with the others. So I'm going to sum it up as best as I can. They're all in Veronaville, early entertainers, financiers, and illusionists. They established the first public amphitheater and school of rhetoric. Proteus was known as being charming but morally grey. Julia was beloved by her poetry. She was loved for her poetry and scholarship. And she taught many of Veronaville's future leaders. Marriage. A famously tumultuous marriage. Julia disguised herself to follow Proteus across the continent after he pursued another lover. They reconciled and married, but their union was haunted by past infidelities and shifting loyalties. Despite this, they are seen as one of the town's more passionate and progressive couples, so I'm assuming this is based off of their source material. Relationships with the other founders. Allies of Portia and Bassanio Monti, obviously that makes sense. They share an artistic and legal reformist vision. Frequent ideological rivals of Julius Caesar, who distrusted Proteus's duplicity. Ties to Lucio and Oberon Zani, especially through shared theatrical roots, may even be distant cousins. So now we're moving on to Lucio and Oberon Zani. Their roles in Veronaville are tricksters, merchants, and cultural disruptors. Introduced taverns, carnivals, and satire. Marriage, scandalous and comedic. Oberon ran a tavern. Lucio was a philandering rogue. Legacy, ancestors of more chaotic or magical branches, possibly linking to the Summer Dream line. Very interesting. And I'm wondering if this is also based off of their source material. Now we are firmly into the 20th century, and whatever left over from the 19th century is relatively gone now. So pretty much the first generation in this timeline is settled in, and they will procreate and give birth to the second generation in their respective timelines, which include Valentine, Vincentio, Sylvia, Francesca, Scribonia, Andromache, Octavius, and Hector. So this is the start of the second generation of Veronaville, but when it comes to the people who are born in Veronaville, they are the first generation born into Veronaville. So they're not migrants, they're not immigrants, none of that. So with that in mind, they have an additional prestige to their names, but they are technically the same generation when it comes to the age gap as the people below that I'm going to describe just now. Within this second generation timeline of the eventual Monty and Cap family branch that's very large, we have 16 people who are born outside of Veronaville around this time. And these people are from the Dottora, Brigella, Norman, Andrew, Alicino, Amantes, Dante, and Scott branches that will eventually merge into the overall Cap or Monty family branch are born outside of Veronaville. Yet again, many of these people are born in Europe or Africa, essentially. Southern Europe, Northwestern Europe, some even from Sub-Saharan Africa, and some have a mixture. But they're born outside of Veronaville. They are not in Veronaville yet. So when it comes to the people in Veronaville, it's the original first generation and their descendants, which are the top 8 that I have above in this picture and timeline. Now we're going to break down and look into generation 2 of the Cap and Monty timeline. So these are the children of generation 1. So I'm going to do the Monty line first, then the Cap line, since ChatGPT gave me a decent amount of notes here. So they are essentially 75 to 100 years before the events of the game, where it says it's possibly the peak of the Monty and Cap feud. I wouldn't say that, but I would say it's rising. The power struggle intensifies. Tragedy may strike their implied deaths, and as we all know, they all die very early. This is also the generation where the Summer Dream legacy begins, and they start the magical household. So they are, give or take, born between the 1910s to 1920s. They come of age in the 1930s to 1940s, and they are parenting Generation 3 from the 1940s to the 1960s. So, Valentine Monty is the son of Bassanio and Portia Monty. He's the patriarch of the Monty second generation, a shrewd negotiator and charming aristocrat. He attempted to walk the line between diplomacy and ambition. He married Silvia Capitano, forming an alliance between the Monty and the Capitano households. Legacy. The union solidified the Monty presence in Old Town. Valentine is the direct ancestor of Antonio. I'm pretty sure they meant Patrizio Monty, and the grandfather of Romeo and Monty. They're his great-grandchildren. His grandchildren are Antonio, Bianca, and Claudio Monty. Now moving on to Silvia Monty, née Capitano. She's the daughter of Angelo and Mariana Capitano. Her role is a fierce matron and landowner. After marrying Valentine, she became a driving force in expanding Monty vineyard and property. Her legacy is instrumental in building the Monty wealth base. Mother to Patrizio Monty. I don't know why they confuse him with Antonio. Feud position. Hard Monty loyalist by the 1940s, influenced by her husband's betrayal at the hands of the Capps. Interesting. Vincentino Pantalone. His parents are Proteus and Julia Pantalone. Role. Politically sharp and deeply theatrical, Vincentino expanded the Pantalone theater guild, turning it into a powerful cultural and financial engine. Marriage. Married Francesca Zanni, further merging theatrical dynasties. Legacy. Their descendants are tied to the Summer Dream family. I don't know how. Maybe it's based off the source material, with some bloodlines believed to feed into Puck and Hermia's heritage. I have no idea where they came up with this. Feud position. Often opportunistic. Played both sides, but leaned Monty due to ties with Valentine. I kind of figured that, which would lean into how their daughter played into things. Francesca Pantalone Zanni. Parents Lucio Zanni and Oberon Zanni. Role. A former performer turned political wife, Francesca brought lower class legitimacy and satire to the elite. Marriage. Married Vincentino Pantalone, bringing Zanni flair into the Pantalone legacy. Legacy. Cemented the Bohemian opposition to Cap aristocracy. Likely the grandmother of some Summer Dream descendants, I don't know how. And cemented the Bohemian opposition to the Cap aristocracy. I'm wondering if this is where Isabella and Contessa's eventual feud maybe came from, outside of the men. Feud position. Sided with the Montys philosophically and artistically. Now we are moving on to the Cap branch, so essentially Contessa and Consort's parents. So we're first going to talk about Scribonia Cap, who's the daughter of Cleopatra and Antony Cap. Her role is a historian and tactilian. Scribonia served as a private tutor to future Cap heirs, so her daughter Contessa, and helped pen the first Cap family chronicles. Marriage. Married into the Dane line. I don't know where this comes from. She married into the Caesar line. It says it right below here. Cementing intellectual dominance of the Cap legacy. I could see her becoming friends with the Danes, but we'll get more into that later. Legacy. Her writings form the basis of the official Cap version of Veronaville history. Feud position. Firm Cap loyalist, though often urged restraint and diplomacy. Octavius Cap, née Caesar. His parents are Julius and Calpurnia Caesar. Role. Politician. Expansionist and reformer turned tyrant. He reshaped the Cap political wing, focusing on control over law, education, and marriage. Marriage. Rumored failed engagement to Silvia Capitano. Interesting. Eventually married within the Cap family, so he married Scribonia. Legacy, grandfather of Consort Cap. That's not the case. He's Consort Cap's father-in-law. He's the daughter of, he's the Contessa Cap. Consort's wife is Octavius's daughter. Octavius's grandchildren are Consort's kids, Goneril, Cordelia, Kent, and Regan. His laws shaped Veronaville's power structures for decades. Feud position. One of the first overtly anti-Monty figures. His fallout with Valentine Monty sparked major conflict. So, Patrizio and Contessa, whom we know eventually date, came from parents who had their own feud. Interesting. Andromache Thebe. She's the daughter of Queen and Etienne Thebe. Her role, a mystic, healer, and a philosopher. She founded Thebe House, a neutral, spiritual, and academic retreat. Marriage. Unmarried or cloistered. Had children with unknown or multiple partners. Possibly the Torah or Dane lines. We know this is incorrect, or maybe. We know she marries Hector. I'm assuming it's just a marriage she didn't care about. I don't know where that came from. Legacy. Ancestress to modern Veronaville mystics and healers. Possible inspiration for the Summer Dream's ethereal traits. I believe Andromache's a popularity sim, so I can see her bonding with the Summer Dreams over that type of stuff. Feud position, neutral, often condemned both houses for their obsession with pride and violence. I could see this because she and her husband are popularity sims. But their son clearly went a completely different direction. Hector Thebe, nee Albion. He's the son of Priam and Hecuba Albion, warrior poet and town watch commander. He tried to hold the peace between the rival families in early Veronaville. Marriage. A nun or a late, not the case. He marries Andromache. Possibly connected to the Norman family. Interesting. I know the Norman family eventually becomes a part of the Cap family, and we'll talk about the Generation 1 Norman family soon enough. Legacy. Ancestor to Veronaville's guard and military tradition. Died defending neutral grounds. I'm wondering if this was due to his son's feud with the Montys getting out of control. We'll get more into that later. Feud position. Neutral, tragic figure. Killed during a Monty Cap skirmish. So, Generation 2 involves incoming families. So, migrants and social climbers who are not born in Veronaville, but they migrate to Veronaville. It's already a set up neighborhood. The founding family already built the foundation for it. So they're entering Veronaville knowing that it is an upcoming stable area. So unlike the core lineage of this family or this generation, these people are not born here. That's one of them. And the second is that they all live until elderhood. So either they are the same age as the core, which I doubt, but they live until elderhood, meaning that they interact with their grandchildren, i.e. Hero and Olivia Monty and Cornwall and Albany Cap. But according to at least Cornwall and Albany's memories, heck, even their in-laws' memories of those people I just meant, there's no indication that they met their grandchildren. So with this in mind, I and ChatGPT assume that they're actually older than the core Generation 2, with their birth range being from 1895 to 1905, and they are arriving to Veronaville around the 1920s to 1930s. So technically, these individuals were born around the end of Generation 1's reign. So they're technically in between the first and second generations, but they're kind of grouped in with Generation 2 because they impacted the same area or the same era as the core Veronaville-born children of the founders. And all of their children, i.e. Generation 3, are peers. And these people's children will be the friends and allies of either the Contessa or Consort Cap or the Isabella and Patrizio Monty. So that's the baseline for all of this. We're doing a lot of setup here. So on to the Toro family. So they are from Bologna, Italy. They're linked to universities and law. The founder of Dottore Medico, a physician slash philosopher. They're the advisors to both the Montys and the Capps, but they are seen as manipulative. So the Dottore family, their legacy are a neutral, powerful presence. His descendants obviously became judges, teachers, or strategists. The Brigella family. Their origins are traveling performers and spies from Bergamo. I think that's in Italy. Their role is to introduce commerce and espionage into Veronaville's politics. And then their legacy is that their blood runs in the town's most cunning negotiators and opportunists. Okay, so that kind of makes sense because the Montys are cutthroats in their own way. Onto the Aretino family. So the origin. They are Romani adjacent performers from France or northern Italy. So Romani adjacent meaning they potentially have some admixture there from the Middle East and maybe South Asia. So they're comedic performers and illusionists. They help populate the lower wards of Veronaville. So we're going to move on to the Amante family, where the origin is Spanish exiles and love poets. I did mention either in their video or the old one that I deleted that the last name Amantes is Spanish and one of them is black. So maybe some more influence there, we don't know. So they brought passion, scandal, and music to Veronaville. Onto the Norman family. So their Anglo-Norman lineage makes perfect sense. They have a military background. Their role is to enforce order during the rise of the Monty and Cap feud. Very interesting, and it just says here that they will align with the Capps, and we know that's their grandson, i.e. Albany. Cap is very into the Cap lineage. The Anjou family origin from French nobility in exile. They sought to restore monarchism to Veronaville, and their bloodline faded, but may have influenced the Capulet-style elitism. And then the Dane family, they're from Northern Europe, i.e. Denmark. I believe I had counted them there as well. They are into literacy and philosophical elite. And their children are amongst Veronaville's scribes, historians, and playwrights. The Scott family are obviously Scottish. They are mercenaries and farmers. And their descendants are loyalists, blacksmiths, and knights. So, based on the Summer Dream family tree, missing a generation compared to the Montys and Capps, I have the assumption that they arrived to Veronaville later than the other two families. And with the timeline that I have in my head, and from what I will eventually show you, I predict that fae-like humans or human-like faes from the Summer Dream, Featherlight, Gossamer, and Bamboo family branches appear in the forests of Veronaville. And this makes sense because if you look at the Summer Dream household, it's literally behind a bunch of forestry. And they're very intertwined with the forest compared to the other lots. And just from looking at all their ancestors and even their descendants' ears, they all have the pointed ears, and a lot of them are based off of fae-like creatures. So this means that they migrated to Veronaville around the time that the other migrating families did, but they were born a few decades prior. So 1900s, maybe even 1890s. They could be the bridge between the Generation 1 and the Generation 2 OG families, age-wise, but based off of their spot and descendants. And when they came into Veronaville, they fit more with the Generation 2 timeline. Just like the outside families. Okay, so they, like their colleagues, ended up being born around late the 1890s to 1900s. Presumably, that's just a rough gradient or range. They arrived in Veronaville at around the 1920s to the 1930s, according to what ChatGPT said based on the timeline. And they also live until elderhood. So they have a longer timeline in comparison. And they have that range, but we don't know when. And they die in adulthood compared to adulthood like the Generation 2 OG families. So these are individuals that were born around the end of Generation 1's reign, so they're technically in between the first and second generation, but grouped with Generation 2 because they impacted the same era as the core Veronaville born children of their founders. And it also says in the Generation 2 timeline, which is 75 to 100 years before the game, so this is from 1924 to 1895, or 1895 to 1924, technically. The Summer Dream legacy begins with Titania and Oberon's ancestors starting the magical household, obviously being the Summer Dream household. So now we're going to break into, or get into, the Fae-aligned couples in Veronaville, who arrived yet again at around the 1920s to early 1930s. So we have Brilliante and Pistol. Summer Dream. Brilliante has ancient lineage from the Dreaming Court, whatever that is. Pistol is descended from the Wandering Hill Fae with a flair for performance. Their marriage is a romantic bond sealed through ancient Fae rites or rituals, not legally recognized by Veronaville law at the time, though as we see through the family tree, that might not be the case. And ChatGPT predicts them arriving at around 1923. So, Brilliante created the Summer Dream Grove, which is a magical neutral zone for storytelling, healing, and celebration, documenting Fae history in illuminated tomes and predicted young changelings. Pistol, ever theatrical and disruptive, founded a traveling troupe that mocked both Monty and Cap elites. I can so see them doing that, fostering a rebellious youth subculture. He introduced Fae satire into local traditions and mentored outsiders with untapped magical potential. So, the legacy. Raised multiple children, including heirs to the Summer Dream name, possibly including Oberon's lineage, and I can definitely see that because Oberon and Titania were hanging around in some sort of treehouse or whatever in their childhood, and I could just see, and based on them adopting a lot of kids, I could just see that being in their bloodline. Brilliante's memory endures as a spiritual patriarch, where Pistol's stories became campfire legends. Brilliante's a woman, so I'm pretty sure they meant matriarch. Onto Damien and Sylph Featherlight. So, Fae lineage. Sylph is a light Fae, air-bound spirit tied to seasonal rhythms, and Damien's a mortal-born, spiritually Fae-aligned, a scholar who turned to Fae life through initiation. Interesting. Anyways, their marriage was quietly joined to sacred wind rites, lived in harmony in the Featherlight Hollow, with ChatGPT predicting them arriving at around 1927. Contributions to Veronaville. Sylph ran a seasonal aerial dance rituals in Veronaville's open fields, casting charms of joy and memory. She trained young Fae-born orphans in the art of balance and movement. Ooh! I'm wondering, this is how Puck was kind of tied into this, since his parents, Damien and Sylph's grandchild, looked after a young Fae-like orphan. Damien, a teacher of both the magical and the mundane, created the first inclusive schoolhouse where hybrid and noble children studied side by side. He translated dreaming dialects into Simlish and taught early literacy. Legacy. Their descendants carry on traditions of diplomacy, mediation, and quiet magical service, and I could definitely see that. Damien's influence was subtle but far-reaching. Many Generation 3's leaders were his pupils. Now, on to Nim and Chalk Gossamer. Nim's a hybrid descended from the Water Fae and human textile artisans, where Shock's a diluted Fae-human mix with trickster blood from the Caravan clans. They eloped in secret during a spring festival, union not blessed by the traditional Fae elders due to Shock's volatility, and they arrived, give or take, around 1930. Contributions. Nim opened a thread and magic shop, which had garments of memory and protection. She was a silent peacemaker, donating cloaks to refugees and healing cloths to wounded duelists. Shock led an infamous enchanted carnival on the town's outskirts, a roving rebellion of misfits, illusions, and political commentary. And he created public enchantments like living street murals, talking signs that unsettled the status quo. Legacy. Though misunderstood in their time, their union produced fiercely independent children who would challenge Veronaville's moral binaries in the next generation. Very interesting, because the next generation's where stuff really pops off with Veronaville. And we're finally getting to Momentilla and Bob Bramble. So their family lineage has Momentilla being a wild fae and Bob being a hybrid. Their marriage, it has them being joined under the old laws of forced unions, and oaths spoken beneath the moonlight with living witnesses, which included animals and trees, and their arrival is speculated to be at around 1922. Contributions. Momentilla was a keeper of wild herbalism, treating ailments both magical and physical. She trained a secret circle of midwives, apothecaries, and caretakers, especially helping those cast out by noble society. Bob helped build the Fae refuge networks, crafting dwellings from living trees, underground roots, and hidden doors. He taught survival, gardening, and enchantment to any who asked, including Monty and Cap children in secret. Very interesting, and I guess it shows that the Monty and Caps weren't blind to what the summer dreams were. Legacy. The children blended earth magic with civil knowledge, eventually helping construct the post-war healing gardens and neutral zones used in Generations 3 and 4. Very interesting, because that's also kind of Oberon and Titania's generation, which is Generation 4. So, in my prior video, I had this in my timeline, and I'm going to keep it because once you look at the family trees of all three families, you will notice that the second generation of each of these family branches always die as an adult. Whether it's the main Monty branch, the main Cap branch, the main Summer Dream branches, and the ancillary family branches, the second generation person, which is the person who's technically first generation born in Veronaville, always dies as an adult. So I like to theorize that somewhere in the 1920s and 1930s, there was an accidental curse that was placed on every second generation Veronaville family, i.e. the first generation born into the city, to have early demises. And this would be when the Generation 2 people, so Patrizio, Isabella, Contessa, and Consort's parents, were growing up or were young adults. I think they were children or adolescents at around this time. So I think something happened around here that caused them and every other person in their position in their family branches to suffer this unfortunate fate. So here is where you start to see where a decent amount of the founding members of Veronaville, from the 8 original families and Generation 1, the people who founded Veronaville, they put their blood, sweat, and tears into the town, they start to pass away at around the 1930s and 1940s. I did this because when you look at Patrizio, Isabella, and Consort's memories, they don't know their grandparents at all. They don't really address them. So this must have happened with their grandparents passing away before they were really born, or when they were very, very, very young, because the 1930s and the 1940s is where the third generation starts to take place. I wrote in ChatGPT about their time spans, and they gave me some theories or ideas about their unfortunate passings. We're gonna go through each of them. Now we are moving on to Generation 3 of Veronaville, and this consists of the grandkids of the original 8 families, so Consort, Contessa, Isabella, and Patrizio. And we have the children of the migrant families, which includes the children of the Normans, the Anjous, the Danes, the Scots, the Dottores, the Brigellas, the Arlecchinos, and the Amantes. And these would be the parents of the in-laws that are active in Veronaville when the game is played, and they will marry into... they are the parents of the kids who will marry into the Monty or Cap families. And it is presumed that a lot of these people either chose a side between the Montys and the Caps. And because they are the first generation born in Veronaville, they all pass away as adults too. this is really the last generation where most of the family is ancestral, meaning not relevant to the current Veronaville narrative. And all but two of them were born in Veronaville. So this is like the last of the migrant families coming in. The exception are the Gales. So this is Caliban's parents who were born in Britain and most likely migrated to Veronaville in the late 1940s, where they are a part of this generation, but they are a bit older than a lot of the others, where they are the only ones outside of the four that are known in current Veronaville who pass away as elders. And I'm assuming they passed away alongside the adults from this generation. So I'm assuming this meant that they're already a bit older. I'm not going to have a whole lot to say about Consort and Contessa and Isabella and Patrizio because they are more active sims in the timeline and you don't need a lot of theories to kind of put the holes together. So pretty much for Generation 3, Chat GPT says that they're born circa the 1940s and 1950s. I kind of have some of them being born in the late 30s. They are the parents of Veronaville's Generation 4 family. Their adult lives mark the post-war transformation of Veronaville, including shifts in political power, fae visibility, modernization, and the final tragic clashes between the Montys and Capps. And I definitely think this is where shit hits the fan, for sure. Some of them, especially the main four, suffer the aftermath of the untimely deaths of the Generation 2 figures, becoming orphans or raised in fragmented lineages. And we're definitely going to get more into that. So with Contessa Cap, she's likely a noble Cap by birth, potentially married a cousin in Consort. That's interesting to say the least. I think Chat GPT was just Chat GPTing. But nobility makes sense. Her name evokes nobility and formality, for sure, possibly given posthumously or as a matriarchal title. No, that's her first and last name, and she is a matriarch. Consort Cap grew up witnessing the collapse of his parents' generation, shaped by grief, rivalry, and ideological rigidity, and that definitely makes sense, especially post everything that happened with Patrizio, which we'll definitely get into. He marries Contessa Cap, obviously says that she is a Cap cousin or a minor noble. I don't foresee them as cousins, but them both being nobles makes sense. Patrizio Monty, when it comes to his background, he's the son of Valentine Monty and is heir to the Monty family business, likely vineyards or theater. So we know that he and Isabella become restaurateurs, but it doesn't really seem like their parents or their ancestors had that lineage, and they seemed more like farm people. So vineyard kind of makes sense. He grew up during the golden age of Monty commerce and art, but under threat from rising Cap influence, and we will see how that clashes once they become teenagers, and adults especially. And now we're moving on to Isabella Monty, who likely came from an artistic or a fae-touched Italian family. I don't really see the fae elements. The artistic part, it definitely makes sense due to her huge interest in cooking. And out of she and her husband, she's really the creative cook in the family. He's just more the business figurehead. We'll get more into that a bit later. She does end up marrying Patrizio, embracing the Monty traditions of romance, performance, and loyalty. And we will see how that takes place. Despite her not being actively involved in the feud when she's younger, she becomes a lot more active once she becomes an adult and obviously marries Patrizio. So I'm going to go over brief descriptions regarding the other people from this generation since they are long deceased by the time the game starts and they're essentially ancestors and not really that relevant to the overall timeline. So we have Richard and Anne Norman. These are the parents of Albany Cap. It's pretty much presumed that they're close to Consort and Contessa, where they upheld traditionalism, structure, hierarchy, and conformity, where Richard could have been a Cap. Yeah, he was a Cap loyalist and could have helped when it comes to protocol and old laws. and helping strengthen the Cap political power, particularly in civil rights, permits, zoning, and education, where Anne could have been a cultural conservator and social gatekeeper, organizing events, enforcing etiquette, and regulating who was acceptable in the Cap social circles. We move on to the Danes. These two are Cornwall's parents with Hamlet and Tobia Dane. Hamlet is the son of Hamlet, so he's Hamlet Dane the second. His role could have been being the symbol of cultural elitism, curating acceptable versions of Veronaville history, tending to downplay Monty narratives and maybe fae narratives from the official records, and maybe founding or influencing the Veronaville Institute of Drama or History. I'm pretty sure some of that background comes from the inspiration from the actual Hamlet play, where Tobias Dane is a relatively quiet but powerful woman who handled all the behind the scenes Cap affairs, since they're also very close to the Caps, maybe handling and managing affairs, potentially tutoring the likes of Goneril and Regan, writing children's literature that subtly endorsed obedience and order. And that's very interesting because her son ends up marrying Regan, and there's some scuttlebutt about that marriage being arranged, so that's a little interesting tidbit there. Now we are moving on to the Monty side, which includes the Arlecchino and the Totoro families. So with the Arlecchino family, we have Tranquillo Arlecchino and Maria Arlecchino, who will become Hero's parents. So, Tranquillo Arlecchino was most likely some sort of performer, playwright, or entertainer, and was very Monty aligned. Um, he could have ran or helped revive the folk theater and public festivals, celebrating Veronaville's more colorful, multicultural past, and he rejected Cap's censorship and elitism while openly mocking the Caps in satirical plays. I'm wondering if this is based off the character or the source material of the character, whether he was in a play or some other mythology or whatever. Anyways, on to Maria Arlecchino. She was Trinculo's emotional anchor, the one who managed their troupe, preserved records, and passed on Monty or traditions, and pretty much was very Monty affiliated during her lifetime. Now, on to the Totoros. These are the people who will end up being Olivia's parents, or they are Olivia's parents, where we have Holofernes and Judas the Toro. When it comes to Holofernes, he most likely was some sort of physician, herbalist, or scientist, where he brought progressive medicine to the Monty side of the society, treating all classes and species, while defying the Cap's regulations on unauthorized remedies. So the legacy, or supposed legacy, according to ChatGPT, is that he left behind some controversial journals the Caps tried to suppress, which is very interesting. Now on to Judith the Toro. She was some sort of community, or she could have been a community healer and educator. Anyways, they all ended up dying as adults, which is why they became ancestors, since they're not really relevant to the modern narrative. Now we are moving on to the Gale family, and these are the last people to migrate into Veronaville. Meaning, in the timeline, these are the last people who were born outside of Veronaville who came into Veronaville. And these are Caliban Cap's parents. So, when it comes to Prospero and Sycorax, he was most likely some sort of philosopher, educator, failed politician, or a reformist bureaucrat. He could have been known for being a rationalist, secular ideologist to Veronaville and promoting education, transparency, and human agency over lineage or faith, where Sycorax was most likely some sort of social theorist, community builder, and public speaker. where her first independence, sharp critiques of patriarchal systems, and belief in self determination, especially for a woman and children of mixed backgrounds, made her stand out. So I could see them as being kind of the neutral party once they migrated to Veronaville and not having any solid ties to either when it comes to a friendship or a conflict. But obviously, with whom their son married, that might have changed and leaned towards the Capps as time went on. But that's a possibility. Now we are moving on to the second generation of the Gossamer, Summergene, Featherlight, and Bramble family being born. So these are the ones who are the first generation born in their families. And like I mentioned, for the outside families from this generation, and even the main families in the prior generation, who are all first born in their families when it comes to being vulnerable citizens, they don't tend to live very long, but as we all know, with these four, who are Titania and Oberon's parents, they are also faes, or fairies. Pretty much they have that headcanon, so it applies to these four. Also, around this time, immigration in Veronaville in general starts to slowly decline as the last family that migrated there, i.e., the Gales, that already happened at around this point in time, or it'll happen around here. So now we're going to get into brief descriptions of them, and just from what I typed on ChatGPT about them. So with Faye Summergene, obviously she's a Fae, maybe glamour based, with possible ties to air or spring domains. Her personality was most likely playful, nurturing, and eccentric, with her having emotional intuition, most likely with potential mischievous kindness and strong empath, and I could see that since her daughter has that trait. Alvin Summergene's most likely a Fae or a Fae human hybrid. I'm just gonna go with the Fae. Likely of Wood or a Starlight Fae. His personality was most likely around gentle, quiet, and observant. The traits he most likely had was a melancholy artist, empathic loner, possibly a healer, and I can also see that and how Titania would inherit that. Zephyrata Gossamer was most likely a high Fae descent, possibly of Air or Dusk Fae. Family lineage values flight, freedom, and beauty. Her personality was most likely impulsive, charismatic, emotionally intelligent, maybe, and her traits, or the traits that she most likely had, was a dancer, diplomat, and an impulsive wanderer. And onto the final person is Sprite Gossamer, who was most likely a Fae, though it says Fae human hybrid, but we'll just stick with Fae, who was most likely deeply rooted in earth and mischief than his cousins, based on this brief description. He most likely had a grounded, clever, or protective personality, and he most likely had the traits of a tinkerer, herbalist, builder of enchanted items, or hidden gardens. So now we have to talk about the inciting incident of Veronaville, which took place in this timeline in around the early to mid 1950s, but we have to give some background first. So, as you see here, it says Contessa Capps and Patrizio Monty are the it couple of the teenage 1950s Veronaville, and Patrizio Monty is in a dynamic duo brofest with Consort Thieves. If I remember correctly in the memories, Consort and Patrizio were friends from childhood, so this was before adolescence, and I think that these three were closer had dealings with one another because they were a part of the same elite cohort of young Veronavillians, heirs to old families groomed for leadership, as they are all third generation and are from the founding families. Isabella isn't included in this for a while because she's kind of just doing her own thing. We'll get more to her a bit later. So you see the setup immediately here with the three of them. So I want to get into the relationship of Patrizio, Monty, and Contessa Cap, and what brought them together. They essentially had the same family and fortune aspirations, where both of them dreamed of legacy, stability, and deep roots, and this obviously has to do with their lineage and being from the founding family. And I honestly think Consort and Patrizio were friends for the same reasons, due to their aspiration, strong emphasis on legacy, them having the deepest roots in Veronaville, and all three of them having some attachments through schooling, business apprenticeships, and or social circles. Ultimately, the dynamics between the three of them and Isabella eventually permanently changed somewhere around the mid 50s or so, or at least that's when it started, and a few things happened. Consort and Contessa ended up breaking up. Patrizio and Consort end up falling out. Both Consort and Patrizio worked in the business career, and Patrizio somehow ended up getting fired. And somehow Isabella took on the dislike of Consort and Contessa, even though she wasn't directly involved, though she also has deep ties to Veronaville due to being the only other one from this generation who was a part of the founding families. Any way you look at it, the business tension between the Thebe and Monty family, or Consort and Patrizio, a deteriorating relationship of Contessa and Patrizio essentially forced a permanent split in Veronaville. We're going to break this down into sections. So, I really want to break this down into the four quadrants, meaning the interactions between each of the four people. And obviously, the first one that starts things off is Patrizio and Contessa. So obviously they split up, but it left more than just romantic scars. They end up becoming enemies because Contessa, quote unquote, betrayed Patrizio by choosing Consort, not only romantically, but socially, aligning herself with the Capps or the Thebes' rigid structure and abandoning the more emotionally grounded Monty world. So it's more than just romantic, but pretty much it being seen as the Monty's not being good enough compared to the Thebes, or the Monty's not being good enough for the Capps, i.e., her lineage. Patrizio never forgave her for trading love for power. He saw her as cold, manipulative, and calculating. Contessa, on the other hand, most likely viewed him as immature, impulsive, and a risk for her long-term legacy, especially after his fall from grace in the business world, which we'll get a bit into later. Their breakup may have been mutual at first, but after Patrizio's firing and career shift, the shame and resentment calcified into outright animosity on both ends. So let's get into this a bit more. So the Capps were struggling with Scribonia dying and the lineage being thin. So marrying a Thebe, i.e. Consort, could reinvigorate the Capp name with respectability and order compared to the Montys, where Patrizio, while charismatic and from a strong family, represented the volatile, romantic Monty energy, less appealing to Contessa's future-oriented sensibilities. Patrizio also likely clashed with the Capp hierarchy, so i.e., the Capps being matrilineal and her parents, and clashing in the business world. Bold moves, anti-bureaucratic stances, or open defiance of corrupt practices. He may have lost a critical deal, embarrassed a Capp backer, or made moral decisions that cost him favor. Eventually, he was fired from the business career, not just professionally, but socially exiled from that sphere of influence. Contessa may have left Patrizio, but feared his unpredictability would derail her long-term vision. She chose Consort not just for his business alignment, but because he shared her vision of order, strategy, and multi-generational planning. It was a head over heart decision. Sacrifice the warmth of youth for the security of dynasty. So it is time to get into Consort and Patrizio. And remember, Consort's a Thebe at this point in time, not even a Cap yet. So their feud's beyond just the Monty and cap dichotomy. So with Patrizio and Consort, there are some sort of political rift. Obviously, we know that they were childhood friends, so they had the same worldview at some point. But as they got older, things diverged. And remember, Patrizio was also in the business career in his youth, like Consort was. But that changed as their worldviews diverged dramatically. Consort only doubled down on institutional power, so things like law, real estate, and conservative order, becoming increasingly rigid and obsessed with reputation, especially with him also being from a matrilineal family, so him going to the more matrilineal and powerful family just makes sense. So things might have changed with Patrizia becoming somewhat rebellious, and you could say that his use of his business acumen to eventually become a restaurateur might have become a part of it. Patrizio was being seen as a liability in the business world, which Consort also agreed with, which kind of squashed or squandered Patrizio's potential in that world, and Consort may or may have sabotaged him, which brings up to the next point, with Patrizio seeing Consort as a sellout, a cold-hearted bureaucrat upholding systems of oppression and killing the town's emotional soul. So there's the political elements that cause them to diverge, and after being fired, Patrizio rejected institutional power and turned inward through the culinary career, which equals heritage, care, and expression. And we'll get into how Isabella played a huge part into that, and a return to the Monty roots, family over status. Patrizio is a family sim, and and Contessa are fortune sims. Isabella's also a family sim as well. So, Consort doubled down on business, using the opportunity to fully consolidate power, erasing rivals and controlling Veronaville through law, finance, and political infrastructure. And obviously, Consort moving in on Contessa right after Patrizio, or around the time Patrizio and Contessa broke up, most certainly didn't help things at all. So, where does Isabella fit into all this? From what we know, from a business perspective and a romantic perspective, the feud started with the three of them, but we will later learn, or if you play the game long enough, you learn that Isabella hates the Capps just as much as her husband does. But where is the origin of her part in the feud? So I'm going to break it down with the third quadrant of Isabella and Contessa. And this one's kind of hard to see because during the game, Contessa isn't alive. But here's what's the most plausible. So, Isabella clearly knows about Contessa and Patrizio's past and likely saw the lingering emotional weight regarding Patrizio and Contessa. So, there might have been, in quote unquote, other woman presence that cast a shadow. And once you click on the game, Isabella no longer has a crush on Patrizio. And if you follow the timeline, Contessa just died. So, could him potentially mourn over her in this weird sick way Haas is about to feel this other woman presence, even all these decades later. It must have started around here whenever she got with Patrizio. She may have felt like Contessa looked down on her as a woman from a lesser background, despite Isabella also being from one of the founding families of Veronaville. Isabella being a more practical, nurturing, and emotionally fluent woman compared to, or rather than, being strategically icy a la Contessa. Isabella was warm, friendly, family oriented, and proud of tradition, but she hated the classist, authoritarian aura that the Capps represented, i.e., Contessa, who is the pure Cap. Contessa likely saw Isabella as unsophisticated and too emotional, perhaps even blaming her for quote unquote ruining Patrizio or making him worse once he went on his own path. So, the Cap women, or the people who were friends with the cast, most likely never accepted Isabella as a Pantalone and later on a Monty. Whether it was a former snub, whispered gossip, or business exclusion, Isabella definitely felt like a target, and she fired back with pride. over time, this tension became personal and ideological, with Isabella raising her children to reject the Cap worldview entirely. So there was some lingering effect from Patrizio, but it just seems like these are two women who just don't like each other and must have had their own petty grievances with one another that divulged from around this time, and it just grew and grew over the decades. So, if you play The Sims 2, you learn that Consort Cap and Isabella Monty, or in this point in the timeline, Consort Thebe and Isabella Pantalon, also heavily dislike and hate one another. But when you look at the timeline, they are the least personally connected to one another. So, why do they end up disliking one another? So, the animosity between the two of them run deep, but unlike the emotional heartbreak between Patrizio and Contessa, this feud is built on ideological opposition, social judgment, and a battle over legacy. So, they never had a personal relationship that turned sour. They simply stood on opposite ends on everything or of everything Veronaville represented. So the ideological clash could be order, i.e., Consort, versus warmth, i.e., Isabella, where Consort views Isabella as a destabilizing influence, a woman who quote unquote softened Patrizio into pursuing cooking and family life over reclaiming quote unquote serious power. Isabella sees Consort as a heartless tyrant who masks cruelty with civility, using tradition and family name to justify oppression. There could be a classist element to it where he sees her as socially inferior, while Isabella sees him as a snob who clings onto a crumbling sense of superiority. And Isabella, though elegant and nurturing, likely comes from more humble early roots than Contessa or the ancient Cap line or Thebe line in Consort's case. Isabella obviously fiercely defends Patrizio, who is her husband, and she also defends his decisions from a business perspective as well. His failure, i.e., Patrizio's failure in the business world, his exit from the power game, she sees as a liberation, unlike a failure, like the Capps see it as. Any chance of civility may have died when Isabella refused to apologize for the Monty way of life, or the Pantalone way of life. And that this eventually became the battle for influence as the generations and the decades go on. As both Isabella and Consort became figureheads, each racing a generation to reject the other, which we saw with their children, which we will definitely get into. And they each believed that the other was poisoning Veronaville's future. And honestly, they weren't incorrect with that, which we'll get into. Now we are in the early 1960s where the second generation curse officially starts, where you will see the second generation, i.e., the first ones that were technically born in Veronaville. So essentially, Patrizio, Consort, Isabella, and Contessa's parents all dying in their adulthood, suddenly and with very little explanation. Obviously, this left the four of them very rigid and heartbroken, and they would all get married soon after this, officially becoming Capps and Montys, with Consort Thebe being Consort Cap and Isabella Pantalone being Isabella Monty, officiating their two families being the main powers, with the elimination of the other ones via intermarrying. And the feud is officially on, and you'll start to see how Veronaville went downhill with the drama almost immediately. Now we are officially in Generation 4 of the Veronaville timeline, and most of these people are alive by the time the actual game starts, and even the ones who are deceased are still relatively relevant in the overall Veronaville narrative. So, from the mid 1960s to the early 1970s, the members of the fourth generation are born. And it's a big deal that a nuclear family has more than one child. As we all know, Consort and Contessa have four children, while Patrizio and Isabella have three children. Go through the Veronaville family trees anytime before this, and they all have one child. Patrizio, Isabella, and Consort and Contessa completely broke this with them having either 3 or 4 children. And that also adds layers to the feud because not only do they extend their families by having more children, they also extend it by passing down the feud to 3 to 4 or more people of their descendants. Also, the Gossamers, the Summer Dreams, have more children, or they have children, i.e., Oberon and Titania. The Arlechinos, the Toros, the Gales, the Danes, and the Normans also have children via Hero, Olivia, Caliban, Cornwall, and Albany. So, at this point, by the point or by the time of Generation 4, the Veronaville feud is no longer just a family rivalry. It is an inherited worldview, etched into the fabric of daily life, social expectations, and even parenting styles. So the Cap children, i.e. Goneril, Regan, Cordelia, and Kent, and the Monty children, i.e. Claudio, Antonio, and Bianca, are under the intense influence of Consort and Contessa and Patrizio and Isabella, respectively. So I want to get into how these 4 people influenced their children when it came to the feud and how they raised their children at the behest of the feud. So looking at Consort and Contessa's influence, with their children being raised by the 2 of them, Consort was cold, exacting, obsessed with control, legacy, and reputation above all. He believed in discipline, obedience, and order, with Contessa's influence being the fact that she's very elegant and calculating, and her background in business also made her stern but socially savvy. She likely adored appearances and proper etiquette, but was emotionally distant. And due to her maybe secretly mourning the loss of her youth and former romance with Patrizio, it might have made her even more bitter, which obviously brought or reflected in her children. So with Goneril, she had internalized expectations of being the perfect daughter and eventual mother, and she overcompensated by producing many children and projecting strength. She tries to mold her family in Cap ideals and herself into Cap ideals, which are discipline, order, and correctness at the cost of emotional warmth. She likely felt neglected by both parents in certain ways, and she now demands respect through control. Regan becomes a high achieving professional to earn approval, but she also partially resents her family deeply. Her marriage, or her eventual marriage to Cornwall, caused her to be cold because she was cold throughout childhood, likely because she was never shown how to model love or intimacy publicly or the proper way. She may have been her mother's favorite in theory, but Contessa likely showed it only through criticism. And this makes sense because when you look at the children, Regan's really the only one who's a dead spitting image of her mother, so that makes sense. On to Cordelia Cap, who is deceased when the game starts. She was probably the emotional child of the family, gentle, dreamy, and maybe slightly rebellious. She could have rejected the feud. Actually, we know she rejected the feud, or been neutral with Amonti, which explains her absence, or her tragic early death. And now on to Kent Cap, who's clearly the black sheep of the family, partially due to the family being matrilineal and him being a male, kind of made him somewhat useless. He was likely shamed by Consort for being soft or disobedient, and graduated towards book and animals and silence or science for solace, not people, as he's not interested in the business career whatsoever. And he was never forgiven by his father for not carrying on the family legacy. Now I want to get into the Montys and how being raised by Patrizio and Isabella Monty affected them. But first, we need to go over Patrizio and Isabella's influence. So, with Patrizio, he's very passionate, temperamental, and emotionally expressive, but he demanded loyalty. He lost his business standing and carried that frustration home and into the culinary career. His feud with content became an obsession, coloring everything. Now, with Isabella's influence, she's fiercely protective, proud, and traditional, likely doted on her sons and expected Bianca to remain quietly supportive, which makes sense since they are a very patrilineal family. She despised Contessa as a social rival, and that bitterness between the two women most likely shaped her parenting. Now, onto how this affected Claudio. He grew up feeling the pressure to redeem the family name or to live up to it the most. He likely was idealized by Isabella and overburdened by Patrizio's very high expectations. His marriage to Olivia de Toro may have been seen as an act of social compromise, not love, but that may. When you count his early death, it adds tragedy, as he never got to see if he could be more than just a pawn in the feud, which is really sad to think about. Now, with Antonio Monti, he took on the role of Stoic Protector after his brother's death, as he's the second child and wasn't the favorite. So, with that, he had to take in the role. And note that both Antonio and Claudio have careers in the culinary career after their parents. Antonio somewhat channels Patrizio's fury, but with less volatility, as he is more so a cold volcano, not a fire like his father. He most likely loved Hero deeply, and her death emotionally shut him down even more so than before. He obviously respects his mother, but he may have resented how she favored Claudio over himself. And with Bianca Monti, she most likely felt overshadowed by her brothers, particularly Claudio, who's clearly the favorite, and it adds even more layers because this is a patrilineal family and Bianca's obviously a woman. She was expected to be the glue to her family without being given any sort of power, and that really makes sense, especially when you look at the fact that she wasn't in the culinary career or isn't in the culinary career when the game starts. And her not being given power kind of makes sense in this family because it's a patrilineal family. She was deeply shaped by watching her parents' hatred and bitterness grow unchecked, and she didn't really want to be that. And she likely tried to escape it all through education or solitude, but can't quite let it go. And it makes sense because once the game started, she really wants to make her own living and to be on her own. So, between the 1960s to 1980s, though more emphasis on the 1970s to 1980s based on when the Gales migrated to Veronaville, you really start to have the depletion of tourism and migration in Veronaville, where no families are really coming in, and these are really the set families that will take over and remain for the next few decades, though once they start intermarrying with one another, these families get smaller and smaller and smaller when it comes to the variety of the families, where instead they just become three large families. So without migration or tourism, Romerville becomes a lot more isolatory compared to the other neighborhoods in the sim world, essentially. And while this is happening, Veronaville is also being known for the culinary and the business sectors. Obviously, at this point, the culinary sector is tied to the Monty family, specifically Patrizio and Isabella, and probably their affiliates as well, while the business sectors is pretty much associated with the Capps, especially Consort and Contessa Cap, as well as their affiliates. So the town's completely separated at this point. This is also around the time where the generation for people, so this would be the adults in the Veronaville game when you play into it, they all are growing up under this regime, so they are either born into the two main families, or they are born into the affiliates who either chose a Cap or a Monty side, and they all kind of stick with this motto and they have to grow up with this. And these are the people who tend to marry into the Cap or the Monty family, and you can predict who it is. While the Summer Dreams are still in the middle doing their own thing, not choosing a side, and are trying to be peacemakers. But essentially, Veronaville is known for what it's known for at around this period of time in the timeline. So we are in the 1980s, and the Generation 2 curse of each of the family branches continue with the Normans, the Summer Dreams, the Gales, the Danes, the Toros, the Gossamers, and the Arlecchino families were all the people pictured here. Sorry, the Gales aren't included in this because they are elders and they came a bit later and they migrated to Veronaville. So technically, they are the first generation of the Gale branch. We all know what happens to their son, but we're not talking about that right now. So essentially, most of Generation 3 passes away as adults. If you notice, they're either the Gossamer slash Summer Dreams, and the rest of them are either Cap affiliates, so these are the Danes and the Normans, and the others are the Monty affiliates, like the Toros and the Arlecchinos. This could be whatever curse just ends up happening to the Generation 2 members passing away early, or we could have the Monty and the Cap affiliates passing away due to the feud becoming fatal, or maybe there's other elements like disease or what have you. But they, for the most part, are dying off, while the Gales are still living at this point, but they do die as elders at around this time. So technically, they do die at the time, but it has nothing to do with the supposed Generation 2 curse or the feud, since they're older and they're elders. This is around the time where their children start to get married and their grandchildren would start to be born, but none of them would really be alive to see that, unfortunately. Now it is time to talk about the fifth and final generation of Veronaville, and this is Generation 5. So they're generally seen as the heart of Veronaville since they are the children and teenagers who are growing into their own, and they determine the future of Veronaville. And they can choose whether to perpetuate the feud and the drama, escape it, or transform it, as well as the legacies of the Montys and Capps, as well as the Summer Dreams, and rediscover or reject the fading echoes overall when it comes to all the curses, the drama, and the trauma. They're all born between the late 1980s to the mid 1990s, with the exception of Ariel Cap, who was born in the early 2000s. They were raised in the direct aftermath of the multi generational trauma, wounds, premature deaths of their parents and loved ones, and a 50-ish-year-old generational feud, though there are inklings of it being well beyond that and arguably a century old, depending on how you want to look at it. Many were either living with absent parents, strict parents, overbearing grandparents, and homes that had a lot of expectations but not a lot of support. So the main tension with this generation is that their families are fractured, their identities are unstable, and the feud and the reputation of Ronaville is now a ghost haunting every single relationship that's in existence. Overall, they don't want this war to be a thing, but they don't really know how to live without it, because at this point, this is the third generation outright living in it. So now we are moving on to the generation for weddings. If you believe Claudio and Cordelia are the youngest in their sibling branch, then they either got married right after aging into an adult or they got married as teens. And it's the same thing when it comes to their children because they're supposedly the youngest, but they birthed the oldest of Generation 5. And it'd be one thing if they birthed one person each and that person was the oldest. They each birthed two each, and they're all the oldest of that generation. So that odd. Maybe there's a teen pregnancy or two there, and an elopement. I don't know. If Claudio and Cordelia are the oldest of their family branch, all this makes sense. Since you're the oldest, you become an adult older. Sorry, you become an older person, you become an adult before your siblings do. The chances of you getting married and having kids first makes sense. So it makes sense for them to get married first to Caliban and Olivia in their cases and to birth their children, with Cordelia and Caliban birthing Tybalt and Juliette. And then soon after this, Hermia, and for Claudio and Olivia to birth Mercutio and Romeo. So pretty much in the order, Tybalt's born, then Mercutio right after, then Romeo right after, and then Juliette. This is probably in like a 2 to 3 year period at the most. So from the late 80s, you still have people like Hermia and Miranda being born late 80s, maybe early 90s. I'm not the most sure. Oh, and Puck was adopted by December Dreams as well. We have Goneril marry Albany around this time, and we also have Antonio marrying Hero around this time. I guess in Antonio's case, it doesn't really matter because no matter what order of the Monty siblings that you believe in when it comes to Generation 4, he's the second and the middle one. But with Goneril, if she's the oldest Cap sibling of Generation 4, she got married and had her children after her youngest sibling, Cordelia, got married and had all of her children. So that's kind of odd. But if she is the oldest, if Goneril is the second child after Cordelia, it would make sense for her to get married second and to have her children second. Obviously, that being Miranda, Hal, Desdemona, and Ariel. And Antonio's kids are Beatrice and Benedict. So, within the early to mid 90s, you have people like Bottom being adopted into the Summer Dream family, the twins, Benedict and Beatrice Monty, being born, as well as Hal and Desdemona Cap being born at this time as well. So, essentially, most of Generation 4 are building up their families, they're getting married, they're having their children, and all but one of Generation 5 is born at this point. I'm not going to get into the personality and stuff like that of Generation 5 because one, they're still young and the life story really hasn't been told yet, and two, I already did that in the other videos. So the late 90s is like the last time there's any notable peace in Veronaville. We have Regan and Cornwall getting married around here, and if she's the third child out of four, it would make sense for her to get married third. They also have no children, so it just kind of makes sense since her older sisters had to get married before they had children, so putting her around here just makes sense timeline wise. And when you look at the pictures in Veronaville when it comes to Claudio and Olivia, the wedding looks like what you see in this picture. But when you look at the photos, it has Patrizio and Isabella as elders, which makes no sense for them to get married before they had Romeo and Mercutio, where Patrizio and Isabella were elders, when that wasn't the case. So I'm assuming that this is a vow renewal, and it's unfortunate for them because they won't get to live much longer before the big tragedies really start to happen. So, we touched upon what was kind of happening around the late 90s, mainly with Generation 4, but with Generation 5, or at least the first crop of Generation 5, they were all children at this point in time. So, they were kind of getting to know one another. They're getting to know themselves, whether they were friends or whether they are enemies. And you can see some of these pictures in the gallery when you click onto Veronaville. So, this is kind of canon, and this is what was happening. There's also some mention of Oberon and Titania maybe putting some sort of spell on the fifth generation to make them be the pillars for the two big families to have peace, and we all know that the results are mixed, or at least so far, based on what we know from around this point in time and what will happen in the mid 2000s when the game officially starts and when Generation 5 or this crop is teenagers. Interestingly enough, the second crop of Generation 5, they all don't know one another. Mainly the Montys don't know the Capps don't know the Montys, but they all know Bottom. That's not the case for the group of people who are in this picture, and that would be teens once Veronaville starts. But like I just mentioned, everything's relatively peaceful in Veronaville up until this period, but that will change for good, essentially, after this. So, in the very, very, very early 2000s, if I were to guess, I would say like 2000 or 2001, maybe, there's a lot of things that end up happening here, and there are four major deaths that take place. The deaths of Claudio Monty, Olivia Monty, Cordelia Cap, and Caliban Cap would change both families forever and made the already tense feud get even more bloody and violent. So, in my opinion, Caliban is the last victim of the Generation 2 curse because in his family branch, the Gales, he is the second generation and he was the first born into Veronaville. So, like all the other families that we have covered, he met an early death, and I feel like that was kind of just fated. Caliban and Cordelia die in a fire, and it's heavily speculated that the Montys caused the fire that would kill the both of them, so the Capps think that the Montys killed them. Claudio, it's not really known how he died. Some say starvation, some say it's something else, but we really don't know how he died. Actually, no, it might have been starvation if I'm remembering correctly. And Olivia Monty is pregnant while she passes away. And there's hints in her bio that she's struggling really, really, really hard with this pregnancy and it pushed her over the edge. So those four pass away, but they obviously have children that are obviously underage since they're children. So Tybalt, Juliette, Hermia, Romeo, and Mercutio are all orphaned and they all lost their parents young and tragically. The Montes losing not only their son and their daughter-in-law, their brother and their sister-in-law, their mother and their father, depending on which Monty member we're talking about, or their uncle and aunt, but especially the third child, I would presume that it would cause some tension because the Montes are a lot more family-oriented and family-obsessed. We are going to bring this up, or we're going to lead this to something else that also happens at around this time. And obviously, the two families are just out for blood at this point. Going through the timeline, we've seen the Generation 2 people pass away under mysterious circumstances that were tied to Contessa, Consort, Isabella, and Patrizio. We have seen their friends and affiliates pass away tragically and young, and now these four. But anyways, we're going to mention the baby, and we're going to transfer it to something else that happens. Okay, so I switched this slide and the slide that's going to come up right afterwards. It doesn't really affect many things when it comes to the timeline, if anything at all, but I mentioned the unborn Monty child, and I'm tying this to Ariel Cap, who's the daughter of Goneril and Albany Cap, was born at this time. I wouldn't be surprised if Goneril and Olivia were pregnant at the same time. So to see the fortune-obsessed Cap family be able to successfully deliver Ariel while the third Monty child died with Olivia and Claudio could cause even more tension. And when you really look at both families, the Caps have more family members despite them being more fortune obsessed, and if I'm remembering it correctly, I do think the Montys have more money despite them being family obsessed. So that's another layer that adds to the tension between the two families, and Area Cap being the most recent metamorphosis of this could cause already tense hatred between the two families to grow even more, especially due to the context of Olivia and Claudio dying, as well as their child. Romeo and Mercutio lost a sibling. Patrizio and Isabella lost a grandchild, and Bianca and Antonio lost, I believe, a nephew. I think the third Monty child was a boy, and Beatrice and Benedict lost a cousin, essentially. Alrighty, so what was happening with the families in the early 2000s? So obviously the orphans, Mercutio and Romeo Monty, as well as Tybalt, Juliette, and Hermia Cap, had to move in with their grandparents. So Mercutio and Romeo moved in with Patrizio and Isabella at the Monty Ranch, and Tybalt, Juliette, and Hermia moved in with Contessa and Consort Cap at the Cap Manor. So essentially, they were raised by their strict grandparents who pretty much raise them the same way they raised the Generation 4, pretty much holding them onto a very tight hold, but things are different with this generation. They're going to do things their way, and Consort and Contessa, as well as Patrizio and Isabella, don't have the same stranglehold on their grandchildren that they did on their children. What is also happening here is that you have a change of who's going to be the next heir. Obviously, with Claudio passing away, it's not going to be him. You would think that it would be Antonio next, but that's really not what happened, or what's happening on the Monty side. It seems like they're kind of grooming Romeo to take over for Patrizio, which is even weirder because he's the younger sibling. Mercutio's the oldest. So you could make the argument that there's favoritism towards Romeo, or maybe they just feel like Mercutio's too irresponsible for it. And we would see the two of them work in the culinary career even after Patrizio and Isabella retire. And this isn't shocking because Antonio works in the culinary career, and Claudio worked there too before his untimely passing. And something similar is relatively happening on the Capps side. But it's even weirder because if Cordelia is the youngest Cap of Generation 4, she shouldn't have been the heir to begin with. It should have been Goneril. But if Cordelia was the oldest, it makes sense for Cordelia to be that. But obviously, Cordelia passes away, so there has to be a new one. You would think with Consort having two other daughters, Goneril and Regan, it would be one of them, especially if Goneril's the oldest. But that's not really happening at all, and it seems like Consort and Contessa before passing, and after Contessa passes, they're grooming Juliette to take over. So essentially, both families kind of sidestep their living children, though Bianca was never an option for the Montys because she's a woman in a patrilineal household, and the same for Kent as he's a male in a matrilineal household. But it seems like Generation 4 kind of got by step over the orphans of Generation 5, and you can see Juliette's being favored as well over Hermia and Tybalt, though Tybalt's a boy, so he was never going to run anything. Though that might have caused Tybalt to overcompensate, where he feels like he has to fight Consort's honor and be the one to live up to the family name the most, despite him being a male in a matrilineal family. But the Montys and Capps have their own relationships with one another, especially within Generation 5, so this isn't working out the way that Generation 3, or the eldest of Generation 3, really wants it to. So, Generation 5 is getting older, with the older batch becoming teenagers, the younger batch becoming children, with the exception of Ariel, of course. And there's a lot more fraternizing between the two families, where in Generation 4, it was mainly just Bianca and Kent. With Generation 5, there's a bunch of them. Obviously, Romeo and Juliette become romantic, though that is looking like it might become a repeat of Patrizio and Contessa with how messy things could get due to their opposing aspirations. You have Mercutio, who has a crush on Hermia. Hermia, who has a crush on Mercutio, as well as Puck, but Hermia and Puck are becoming more of a thing. And Miranda also has a crush on Mercutio. Mercutio's also friends with Miranda too. But you still have conflicts like Tybalt not liking Mercutio at all, Mercutio not liking Tybalt. Romeo and Tybalt don't like one another, and it doesn't seem like Mercutio and Juliette are fond of one another either. So there's a lot of love happening here, but there's a lot of hatred as well. And like I mentioned earlier, Benedict and Beatrice do not know how and Desdemona and vice versa. But they're children, so there's not a whole lot to discuss there either. And it seems like the older generations are becoming more and more aware of the fraternizing between the opposing families in Generation 5, but there's not a whole lot that they can really do about it at this point. And then we have the mysterious death of hero Monty, but there's not a whole lot known about her. Unlike all the other major deceased players, with Yeah, Claudio, Caliban, Cordelia, and eventually Contessa. We have their graves, we know how they passed away. But Hero, there is no grave in sight. The real reason why is because Antonio and the children are a family and they're not in a set house. That's the real reason. But when it comes to this part, it could mean that Hero disappeared for a while and they were just told that she died, but they don't know how she was died and her body was never found. Or her body wasn't found for a long time, where they might have told Antonia, Benedict, Beatrice, and the other Montys that she passed away. But when she passed away is interesting. So I'm assuming they told the Montys in the mid 2000s that she passed away, but the exact time frame as to when Hero passed away, no one knows. And she could have most likely passed away from her family, meaning they weren't in proximity when she passed away. There's a lot of speculation that was done, but whatever investigation happened went nowhere, hence why Antonio wants to find out more about his wife's death, and Benedict is being hinted at being the one who may unsolve the case. This is the most recent event when it comes to the Monty timeline and memory, so I'm assuming that she passed away a bit earlier. No one knew what happened to her for months or maybe a few years, and then they told the family, in the mid 2000s that she passed away a bit before the start of the official game. And now we are chronologically at the final canonical event of Veronaville before the official game starts, with Contessa Capps' death. So it is officiated that she died of old age, though there is some debate about this because when you look into the system, she only lived as an elder for a few days, but that could have just been weird coding. We know that she was meant to live, but they changed it later on in development. But what's interesting about this death is Bianca Monty has a memory of Contessa's death. And it's weird because they're not related to one another, so why would Bianca Monty of all people have this memory? The only thing that would make sense is if Bianca was present sorry. Bianca would have had to have been present on the premises when Contessa died for her to have a memory, since many people who don't know one another have memories of sim deaths when they're on the lot. So that would be the only case why. But if Bianca has a memory of it, was she a part of Contessa's death? We really don't know. But there's really no indication that she was ill or anything. So there's some mystery there. But some could say she just died of old age, and she was also got into a lot of drama and fights and stuff like that. And the stress and running a family and losing her daughter would have just caused her to decline and made it easier for her to be more susceptible to death. And now we are at the point where the game loads and all the historical stuff is done. And that concludes the complete Veronaville timeline, going back to the OG generation in roughly around the Gilded Age up until the present day of the time the Sims game starts, i.e. 2004. This took I don't know about several, but a few months to make. So that explains the hiatus between the last Veronaville video and this video. I did this in part and I just got overwhelmed. I didn't think that it would be an hour and 40 something minutes. I don't know when I do the other cities or neighborhoods if it'll be this long. But you really have everything. Of course, the earlier part, especially with the first two generations, is a lot more speculative, but you need that base to delve into the other generations that we know of. The Generation 3, which are the elders, Generation 4, which are the adults, and Generation 5, which are the youth. I'm pretty sure when I do Pleasant View, Strange Town, and maybe the others, it won't be this long because there aren't 5 generations of several families or more than 3 generations. I think with the exception of the gods, so that will be interesting. But yeah, thank you all for following me on this journey. I do feel better about this timeline and these videos compared to the ones I did a few years ago that I deleted. Anyways, thank you all for watching and supporting. And I don't know if I'm going to do Pleasant View or Strange Town next. I did Strange Town first last time, though I have of course deleted those videos. I don't know if I'm going to do Strange Town next. I might just do Pleasant View, but we will see. Thank you all and take care.